Project Bob is the second in a series of two presentations. The first one was done here on April 5th, and this one is part 2 of it. I'm also planning a part 3 and possibly additional parts, depending on Steve's tolerance for me. But basically, what this is an attempt to do a complete application, and along the way learn about a lot of different things that are kind of the core tools that someone using Swift will need along the way. Okay, so in the first phase, we focused on creating a UI view where we had an image and we had 5 text boxes. So that seems very simple, right? But it took an hour and a half to explain this, to really make it work. And the reason is there's a lot of stuff there. And I made a videotape of that presentation, and you could go online on YouTube and find it and learn about it. But basically, the kind of things we covered was how you handle the keyboard coming up, how you handle, for example, you can see there's a thing that says date joined and a thing that says member, so different ways of entering data into the system. And we'll see that as we go along. But to make a long story short, basically, what this is it's a continuation. It's part 2 of that. So now we have an initial screen, which is the purpose of that screen is to capture data about a member of a group. His name, what city he lives in, his email, his status as is he a member? Is he a guest? Is he a presenter? Is he an organizer? And so on. So that's what we did in Bob 1. And what we're going to do in Bob 2 is we're adding that person data that we caught in Bob 1, and we're going to add it to a table view. And we're going to show you how we can edit, in other words, and how we go back and forth between the table view and that screen. The back and forth, how we add a new person and add it to the table view, how we edit someone that's already in the table view, how we delete someone from the table view. So this is sort of the second half of, if you're creating an application that has members in it, you would need to do something like this. So just so you know, this is a kind of a core capability in a lot of applications. So if you're building an application, you may have something like this. Okay, so that's what Bob 2 will be. And Bob 3 is addressing how you keep the data. In other words, once you've entered it, how do you, next time, and you shut off the application, you come back later, how you pull it up again, called persisting the data. And the way you persist the data is you store it in a database. And then you can pull it back out. And that will be the next thing. And then there might be a 4 or 5, and I haven't really fully thought that through, but this is where we are today. Okay, so today we're doing Bob 2. Now, in Bob 1, we created this member view, as I've explained that to you. And how many of you actually cloned the file Bob2s? Anybody? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so just to tell you what that means. How many of you are familiar with GitHub? Okay, you're all familiar with GitHub. Okay, so just so you know, okay, and you can actually go and, well, I'm not going to take the time to go through the cloning, but I gave information on how you can clone the file. And if you clone the branch called Bob2s, basically what you're copying is the endpoint of Bob 1. In other words, this is what we finished up with Bob 1. Okay, but we did a couple of other things since then. We're gonna create something called a member class. A member class is essentially a class that's where we'll store information about a member. So we'll create an actual class for this. When we did this, we weren't concerned with that because we weren't moving the information between views. in the Bob1 file, when we worked on it, just like in the Bob2 file, we have, we're right now on slide 3. So everything is driven in terms of what we're showing and doing by the slide number that we're on. So now we're on slide 3, and when we get to slide 4, I'll be referring to some code, and all of those. So we had a keynote presentation for Bob1, and it had lots of comments in the actual code referring to slides. So those have been cleaned out. If you download Bob2, everything only refers to slides in the Bob2 keynote. Okay, so it's like a fresh start, but this is where we're starting from. And finally, we're going to do one little thing here. Notice that in the Bob1 view, under Member, there's just one entry here, Status. So one of the things we will do is, we're going to add another cylinder to that. I should explain what that means. We have a property of the member called status. Is he a visitor? Is he a member? Is he a presenter? We also want to include his experience level with Swift. So is he an expert? Is he a beginner? He or she. So the way we entered it and the way we defined it in Bob1 is when you have a list of things that you want to put in that is a specific enumerated set, in other words, visitor, member, presenter, organizer, you don't want people typing that in because someone will mistype something and someone will not remember what it is. So the way we do that in Bob1 is we just pop up one of these roller things, and you just roll through and you say, I want that one, and you're done. And then the system then puts in the thing you selected right into the text field for you. Same thing with date. You don't want to type in a date. You might type in January 35, not a valid date. So you want the system to essentially guarantee the validity of what you're putting in. So in the case of the date, you use a date picker. In the case of guest and expert, we'll have a picker with 2 cylinders now. When we did Bob1, we only had 1 cylinder because we wanted to keep it simple. Now we're getting a little more sophisticated. So these are the things we're going to be doing as we start. Okay. So the first thing we'll do is we have added a file called MemberSwift, and in the generally speaking, model view controller is the architecture of a lot of applications. You probably have heard that. View is what you see. Controller is what controls, essentially controls how you communicate between the user and the view and the data. And model is the actual data. So we're going to create a class, and we'll talk about that in more detail. And this class, we're going to call it member, and it's basically something that defines the information that we want to keep in a member. So you can see we've got a name, and it's a string. We've got a city, an email, that's a string, and so on. And we'll get into that in more detail as we look at it. And we're also going to create some sample data. Okay, so we're going to, now sample data is basically an array. An array is essentially a member is a class, and then if you say let X equal, let X be of type class member, then X has got all of these things. It's got a name, it's got a city, an email, and so on. So it's got all of these properties, and an array of members basically is a collection of instances of the member class. Okay. And the other thing about this is in Bob1, we use the string to store a reference to an image. But when we store data like an image, we don't want to store the string. We actually want to store the image, right? So we will have made a change from a variable called image name to a variable called image, which is a type, a class called UI image, which is a Swift class. Okay? And that, you need to take care of that in 3 places. Okay? So we want to display member status and member Swift level in a single text field. And so we're going to do that with a pick list that's got 2 rollers. Okay? Right now we have a pick list that's got 1 roller. Now that was explained in detail in Bob 1. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how I change a pick list with 1 roller to one with 2 rollers. And you can have a pick list with many rollers depending on what your application is. And the value of a pick list is it's a very easy way to put information in if you want to give a user a set of choices. Now, so the first thing we'll want to do is we'll want to add a new array. In other words, we already have an array status which has got guest, member, presenter, etc. But we're going to create a new array called Swift level, which has got beginner, novice. And you can see these things eventually will appear there. These are just an array of strings, and we'll populate the picker with that. And the other thing we're going to need to do is we're going to create an array of arrays. Don't. What? What's that? Oh boy. Well, it's actually quite simple if you think about it, okay? You've got 2 rollers here, right? And it's exactly corresponds to a table, which has different sections, right? So a roller is like a section. And the rows are like cells. So status is a bunch of cells, of rows, and then Swift level is another bunch, and then you need to know which roller you're in. And obviously, the member info, they're just one that's got an index of 0, one that's got an index of 1. So if you're in the 0 roller, you know it's in the status level, and so on. But we'll see how this actually rolls right in. It's very simple to implement, but I think conceptually for a lot of people, array of array, they have your reaction, oh boy. Okay. The picker list is a class which we added to the UI view, this UI view, and then we needed to, this is all something we did before, we added delegates and the source protocol, and those have certain files that are required. What that means is the picker needs to know, do I have 1 roller or 2 rollers? What's in those rollers? So those are required functions that you want to then delegate what happens here to the UI view. Okay? And this is essentially the file I told you about. And basically, when we're starting, we really just have a single array here. Okay? That's status equal guest. So the first thing we're going to do here is, you'll notice there's a reference here to slide number 4 in Bob 2. And this is the class definition. Now, the reason I do this way is essentially it's disabled. And I do that, and this is the slide 4 section that's disabled. And I just put in a double thing like that over here and one over here. And that's a quick and dirty way of writing all that code and making sure it's all the errors have been worked out. So I'm not spending your time trying to figure out what I did wrong. So we now have a class called class member, and I'll show you one other thing here. So I can take, and you'll find this very useful as we go along, I can highlight this, Command C copies that, Command F is a search, and then Command V pastes that in. And if you do that, you can find this very, very quickly. Okay? So that's how we're going to get around. And here's another slide 4, and that's the sample data. Okay, so we also want to enable that. And the way we'll enable that is the same way. We can go to the end of it. I mean, you can go either way. And then go up to here. And now that's enabled. And you can see now we have a group of instances of a member that will be our sample data that we will work with as we go along. Okay, so these are instances of a member class. So they actually have all the specific properties in them. Okay, and so we have one more thing to do down here, and that's actually it's in 5. Slide 5 is right here. And remember, we talked about the adding a new array for a level, Swift level, and we also wanted to add an array of arrays. So we're going to do that same way. So we just go like this, and we have to remember to do this one with 2 lines. And so now we've got essentially everything we need in this file, and the things we just did were the things we discussed in the slide. Now we have one more thing to do. We also want to make some adjustments to the functions that have settings. So for example, originally we had 1 cylinder, now we have 2. We didn't have 2 arrays now, so we have to take that into account. So how do we do that? The changes to the delegate files, to the files that are enabled for the picker, are done. They're done up here, and they're done in slide 5. So okay. So we're now in a different file. This is the controller file for that user member view, and over here we've got a bunch of things to fix. Go to here, and here is the first change we need to make. This is the function that's part of the picker view protocols. And the first thing we need to do is we now have 2. Now, I just put in the number 2, or you could use the count on the member info array, which would be 2 because it's got 2 elements in it. They both happen to be arrays, but this is easy enough, so I'll just leave it like that. So what I need to do is I'm going to disable this and enable this. And now it knows it's got 2. Same thing over here. In this picker view function, we calculate the number of rows in each component. When we had 1 component, we just returned the status.count, but now we need to return 2 different counts, and we do that by returning the member info for each component. So now we just proceed the way we always do. We enable the line we want, and we disable the line we don't want. And we got to also get rid of the old return of the status.count. And now we have updated. And now that will essentially tell me that if it's in this component, it's got this count, and if it's in that component, it's got that count. Okay? Now, because the member info has got 2 components, so it needs to know which component the count is for. This next delegate for the picker view actually picks up the string and populates the titles in the picker view for both cylinders. And the way it does that is, in the case of just 1 cylinder, just got it from the status row. In the case of 2 cylinders, it has to also take into account the row number. And it does that by getting the member info and the component and the row number, so it can get the right row for that population of the picker view. That's what happens here. And we do the usual of enabling and disabling here. We have one more slide 5 correction to make, and we go right here. When the picker view was just one component, you weren't concerned with which component you're in, right? You've got two components now, so you could be scrolling one or the other. They're independent. They're two spinners. With two cylinders on the picker, we have to take into account which cylinder we're on. And we do this by with this if statement. If the component is 0, then we're in the first cylinder, which tracks status. And if it's not 0, there's only one other one, it's tracking level. We capture the row number that's been selected, and then we use that to store it in the instance of the member. We then go back and copy the information in the actual arrays right into the member status text field, which now includes both status and member level. And we simply take the two strings, separate them with the dash, and add them up. And now we have a single string that represents both status and member level. We have one more slide 5 correction, which we almost overlooked, and it's right here. And we need to enable this because this gives us the sample data that we would need, or the instance of a member property for this UI view. Okay. So we'll get a quick look at what this looks like now. And I'll just give you a very brief tour, but let me first take a look at this particular thing. Well, let me just put in a name here. So if we notice what happens, it slides up, right? And the image fades, and we can go into this, and we can put in a name. And the name is red until we hit done, and then it accepts it. But if we hit member status, we get two scrolls, and we can scroll them like this. So we have two problems here. One, it's only displaying only the status. It's not displaying the level. And so we need to go back here, look at the error, and it looks like we forgot to disable the old member status.txt, which we've actually replaced. So we need to come over here and put in 2 forward slashes. Okay, let's try one more time. And whenever you enable one, you need 2. Okay, so if we go over here, and if we go like this, experienced, guest, member, presenter, and so on. So, and we use a tap recognition to exit that because there is no done button on a roller. And you have a similar thing with this. You have a date here. The default date is today's date. If we change the date, it updates it. And I'm not going to go into this into any detail here now, but this was one of the big changes we made in going to BOP 2. We added another cylinder. And I thought that was an important thing to add. And so there are two use cases for the member view. One is you're adding a new member, right? So what you want to do in that case is you want everything to have default values, no picture, join date is today. You might want to have default values for member status and, Swift level and so on. We want to finish working with this screen. So we're going to create a variable, which is a Boolean, and we'll call it new member. And it's either true or false. So if we want to see the screen the way it looks like if it's a new member, right, we'll set it to true. And if we want to see what it looks like when it's a current member, we'll set it to false. And then we could then use an if statement on this Boolean to do one thing or the other. So we're doing this in preparing this screen for later when we come to this from the table view. When we come to the table view, we'll come into it in different ways, right? When we say we want to have a new member, we probably say add a new member. And if we want to look at a member that's already there, we want to edit it, we'll probably tap one of the members. So we're coming into it different ways, and we're going to use this Boolean, which is now a property of this UI view, to get into it. So this is where we're going to build how this view looks. And in the case of a current member, we're going to need to populate the data that we're going to display. So we're going to grab array number 1 out of the sample data that we have. So we're going to start with a single member. And so if the new member parameter is true, well, that's the member we'll look at. And we have two other things in here. We wanted to put in a default status and a default Swift level. And we'll set them both to 0. Now, when you're designing an application, sometimes you want to give the user the option to control defaults. So if you, instead of just plugging in a 0, which is hard coding, it's a bad practice, you store it in a variable, then you can later on give the user access to this variable in settings. Okay, so generally good practice. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to look at how do we add a member when we need. So we'll need to get default values, and the default values, what we want to appear is essentially an image that says no image. There's the button that says add image. There's a text box, name, city, email. These are the two default values, guest and beginner, and a date, and the default date should be today's date. And the way we do that is we have a little bit of code that says if this is a new member, then for the member image, use an image that's that is identified as no image. So what we're doing is we're picking up an image called no image and converting it into a UI image class. And that's what's being displayed in this UI image window up there. And then for the other things, we just put in default values for the status and for the level. And then what we do, there's a little bit more that we're doing here, is you can see we take the values from the arrays, putting in the default status as to select the row in the array, and then we're taking those two strings and adding them up, and that gives us the guest beginner, right? And we're not putting anything into the top 3 text boxes because the default is we don't know what it is. And then finally, under the date, we're going to set the default value for date, and this is where I do all of that, and I'll go into it in a little more detail when we do that. Okay, so that's how we add a new member, and that's going to be in slide 7. So here's slide 6, and here's where we essentially, create all these. This is where we're putting in the definition of the new member, which can be set to false or true, depending on how we want to look at the screen, and the 2 default values for status and level. Anyway, so it's a new member, so we'll have to set this to true, right? So we'll go just say true. And that's a very quick way of just switching things. It becomes so we know it's a new member, and then Let's just make sure we don't have any other slide 6. I don't think we do, but it's always a good idea to see that you don't. We'll go to slide 7. I should just do one slide at a time. So here is the slide 7 piece of code, which goes all the way to here. And I'll disable this part of it, and then I'll come up to here, and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so if it's a new member, which we said is true, then it will do this. And if it's not a new member, it'll do something else, which we've disabled for now. So what does it really do? It pulls in an image, which is no image. It pulls in a default status, and then it constructs the text that we see. It sets the picker value so that when we go to that picker, it's preset to what is in the text box. There is nothing connecting the text box to the picker unless you connect it. So we got to connect it here. Yeah. And then the date, we're going to set the date to the current date, and that's this function right here. And so we created a variable called date current, and then we set the picker to that date. So the picker itself is set to that date. So if you go to the picker, that's the date that's in there. And if you and we set the date mode. Now you'll notice if you're following this very carefully, I'm duplicating this because I don't really need to do that in 2 places. I just need to set the date picker mode 1 place, but there are various kinds of, I'll just show you this. So if I put in a dot here, you'll get all the date modes, okay? Just so you understand, you control the date picker by selecting a date mode, okay? And we just want to have a plain vanilla date mode, so we just selected that. And then what we do is we use a formatter to convert the date, which is in, I don't know if, I'm kind of repeating what we did a little bit about 1, but basically dates are stored as number of seconds from a given specific date. I think it's in like 1980. So there's a number of seconds that it's keeping track of as the date. So that number includes minutes, hours, months, all of that information. But number of seconds won't tell you what date it is. So you need to convert it into human readable date. And that's what the formatter does. So it takes the date, converts it into a date that you can then put into a text field. And that's what we're doing right there. Okay. And that's how we add a new member. And that's what it will look like when we add a new member. And if we want to edit a member, we get a screen like this. Okay? We'll get a screen with a picture. We'll get a screen with a name and all of that information. And all of that, we simulate this by the bool setting it to false. And then it goes into the else part of the logic. And then now, instead of grabbing information, it's going to grab everything from that instance of the member. In other words, remember we said this member is equal to sample members 1. So it picked up the member from that sample and displayed its information. And this is the way it's displaying it. Okay, so let's go to slide 8. Go to slide 8. And we're going to have to do 2 things here. Let me first take care of this. So we do that over here. And don't forget, you also have to take care of it on this end. Otherwise, it thinks, you've started, you haven't completed it. And the other thing we need to do here, if you remember, this now needs to be false because this is not a new member. So you see how we have just done enough to give us a way to look at the two cases without actually bringing up data from the outside. It's all being done here in this UI view. So let's take a look at this one. And there he is, Albert Einstein. He's experienced and he's a member. And he joined us some 20 years after he died. So he's a remarkable, truly remarkable individual. And and now we can go in here and edit it. We can move him into Santa Monica. Select all. And Santa Monica. Now he's in Santa Monica. Oh, I typed AM. It's okay. So that's it. There's nothing more we can do with Albert Einstein because we have not connected it to anything else. But basically, and then if we want to change it, we realize we've insulted him by not calling him a guru, and we'll make him a presenter, and so on. Okay. So all of this works, and now we know we can display a new member, and we can display a current member, and the switch to do that one way or the other is that new member bool, and that loads it up. Next thing we're going to do is we're now going to step back and add a table. Here's the table view. I've added it to the project, and I'm going to show you what it is. So let me just say some things about adding a table view. There are really two types of table views. There's a table view that has static cells, and if you think about table view, the settings on your iPhone, settings on your iPhone is an example of static cells. Each cell can be different. It's always fixed. It doesn't change. It's not a dynamic thing. There's another kind of cell which is called a dynamic, which is what we think of when we're collecting members into a table view. Okay, so the first thing we want to make sure of is that we identify, because this is in a table view where we're going to be loading up different members, we're going to want to make this a type dynamic. Remember, we talked about static and dynamic table views. There are predefined cells and there are custom-made cells. We'll start with a predefined cell. Predefined cells are, I think there are like 3 or 4 different kinds that are you'll see them all over the place. It's very easy to set that up, and we'll set it up and we'll build a table with predefined cells, and you'll see what it looks like. Okay, so that's the first thing we need to make sure that it is. And we're also going to select the type of cell style, and we'll select subtitle cell. And then we're going to add a navigation controller, and to embed a table view in a navigation controller, all you do is select the table view by any way you can, by either clicking here or clicking here, and then you go up to the editor command, click on that, then you select embed in navigation controller, and your table view will be embedded in a navigation controller, and there will be a place at the top of the table view which will now allow you to navigate. We're going to embed the table view in a navigation controller, and what that does, that is an important thing to understand. A navigation controller is a container. Just like a table view is a container for all the controls. A table view is a view that we have, like with the picture and the text boxes and the button is nothing but a container for those other things that are also, turns out, are special cases of views. And a navigation controller is a special kind of container, and it will appear as the top of your UI view, and and it's a place where you can navigate to different views, and you can do things from there. I'll take that and move it over here. So now when I run the program, it will start with the navigation controller and then launch the table view. So this is a table view that I've named subtitle table view. We're going to add a controller for this table view. Just ignore the name in the slide. We've added member table view controller, except we called it subtitle table view. And we set these two things. Then the other thing we need to do, we need to tell it that these are reusable cells, and because they're reusable, we need to identify them with a name. That's because in a dynamic table view, you can have multiple different types of cells. So the different types of cells you might have, you'd give them different names. In this case, we just have one type of cell, and so we call it member cell, and we'll call it a style subtitle. And notice that in the content view, we'll have default styles, text label, detailed text label, and image view. In other words, normally when you have a label in a view, you have to create an outlet for that label to be able to refer to it. When you're using a default cell, the system gives you these default names for the cells. This was a big gotcha for me for a while, because I always thought you had to create, drag and drop to the to anything you have. Like these are two labels, and normally when you have a label, you drag and drop to some kind of controller file. You don't even need a controller file when you're using default. It makes it very, very simple, but it's also very, very limited. But I wanted to do this just to show you what the difference is. Okay? And the last thing you'll want to do is you need to enable a TableView function that's built into the TableView class that is essentially a function that populates the cell. In other words, how does the TableView know what's in the cell? This is where you do it. You say let the cell be the cell with the identifier member cell, okay? You can just use the default UI TableView cell as the class that you're going to use, because you're using a default class. You don't have to do anything with that. Later on, when we make a custom class, we'll need to have a custom UI TableView cell controller. And then we just let the member equal the index path of the row. We set the text label text to the member name. And then what we've done with the detail text of the default cell, we've constructed concatenated strings. In other words, we've taken the member city plus a space plus the member status, which we pick up from the member status. Member status, remember, has got the value, and we're using the status array to pick the string out from that value. And then, of course, we also have a member image. What it does is it's essentially setting up these values in that cell for all the cells that it's displaying. And if you have 30, as you scroll up and down, they get populated just in time. It's a beautiful thing, is right. So this is all number 12. So let's go and do that. So this is the file that we created. That's the controller for that table view. And right now, right out of the box, it's got very little in it. Okay. It's got some stuff that we're going to enable, but right now it's got very little in it. It's just the table view with a view did load and a view did receive memory warning. But slide 10, which is the slide we're working on, has got a couple of things in it. So let's enable them and see what we're getting. First thing is, how many sections does this table view have? It's got one. And how many rows does it have? And it's got sample members.count. And if you've worked with table views before, this is pretty standard. Okay. And then the next thing we'll want to do in the table view boom, and okay, so this is just what we just talked about, and it's just very straightforward. And so if we just run this program now, remember that we're running this part of the code. In other words, we're starting here, and we're going to populate the table view with the sample data in the subtitle cell style. So let's see how that looks. Okay, so now we've picked up all of the sample data, we've populated the screen, and notice that, you know, the title is just the name of the person, and the detail is the city plus the guest, you know, the status and the Swift level. Okay, but this is really, and the fact that we have it in the navigation is what gives us that little space on the top. But this is really not that great, because you know, it's just not. You might want to do it differently. You might want to organize the information differently. So as a general rule, you need to know how to create a custom cell, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Now we're going to customize the cell. So to do that, when you here's the thing that you need to understand clearly. When you customize the cell, the system doesn't know what you're going to put in the cell. You might have labels, you might have buttons, you can have anything, you know, all kinds of stuff in there. You can have 10 labels, you can have one label. So you need to essentially create a controller for the cell. Okay? Now, it's a controller for the cell that you've created, and theoretically you could have different controllers for different type cells, or you can have one controller for all the various kinds of cells you have. But basically, you're going to wind up doing what you do in the UI view. You're going to drag and drop from your custom labels or whatever images to your controller, and that way your controller will know what to call those fields and how to update them in the cell. Okay, so that's the idea. So we need to add a new file to the TableView controller, and we're going to need to update the class name in the identity inspector, and then we need to change the style to custom. So here's all the things that we're doing here. We're going to add a file to the UI TableView called the UI TableView cell, and we'll call it member TableView cell. And we're going to need to update that in the identity inspector right here. And we're going to need to change the attributes to custom, and we'll need to have an identifier. Okay, so then we're going to start to customize the cell. And when we customize it, we'll change the height to 100. We'll change the image size to 80 by 80. We'll put in a name, and we can set the font style, and we'll put in a location. We'll set another font style for that, and then we'll put a status and a Swift level, and we'll have yet another font style for that. And then when we're done with all that, we're going to go in and drag and drop from the view of the cell into the member table view cell, just like you do in a view. Okay? So it just happens to be a view that's just a cell. And because you've customized it, you've got to create these references to these fields. Otherwise, he doesn't know what it is. So member image will be a type UI image view. Member name label is a type UI label, and so on. Okay? Okay. So now we're going to forget about these guys, and we're going to sashay over to here. And you'll see I've snuck something else in here. Okay? And now we're going to look at this. And you can see this is exactly what I just talked about. So here's slide 15. And you can see it's disabled. So I'll enable it. But that's all that we're going to be doing here, basically. Okay. Notice, here's another thing that you should, when you hold your mouse over this, right, that's the member image, it lights up that. If it holds it over here, it holds it over, it highlights, in other words, it highlights the specific thing that it's connected to. That's always a good thing to know about. That tells you these are connected up. Okay? So in this case, this is a different table view, so we need to go in here and also enable this one in the same way as we did the one that was. So here's over. It's got one type of one type of cells, and it's got these number of cells, and then over here we're now going to be dequeuing it. It's a little different because here we had to make use of the outlets that we created. Remember when we looked at the table view cell, we created these outlets. In other words, these are references to the UI label and Swift level and so on. So these are now available. So let's run it and see how this looks. So now we're working with a table view that's got a customized cell. And as you can see, it's a lot better looking. Plus, it's not so much that this is better looking than the other one. The point here is that you now know you can design your cells. And you can have one or more designs in your table view. You can have one kind of cell for one kind of element and another kind of cell for another. So this is a very elaborate system of things. Okay? So this is the dequeuing conversation that we just went through. Very important point I didn't mention. Remember when we created the controller for the cell, we gave it a unique name. We called it member table view cell. So now we need to essentially, when we create an instance of a cell, we need to downcast it as a member table view cell so that it knows exactly what kind of cell that it is. And then, of course, it's got, and we're populating the cell with all of these things that are things that were created by us through the outlets. When we did you would do a control drag, what you always do to create an outlet. Okay, and this is basically what you get. All of this is the actual cell, and I'll just do a quick footnote here. I have a whole talk about constraints and stack views, and that's in Project Mongoose. But basically, if you look at this, guest and expert are two labels that are in a horizontal stack. Then that stack plus the label Los Angeles, the city and the name are in a vertical stack. And then that vertical stack and the image are in another horizontal stack. So it stacks within stacks within stacks. And it gives you a very relatively simple way of designing a complex view that is responsive to different ways of looking at it. Okay? So, but I'm not going to dwell on that. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about navigation. And navigation is fairly complex when you first look at it. You're going to go from the table view to the member view, and you're going to go from the member view back to the table view. And the way you go back and forth depends on what you're doing. So first thing we're going to do next for navigation, we embedded the table view in the navigation controller. We've already done that. We're going to put a title in the, we can put a title in the navigation controller, and we're going to add a bar button in the navigation controller, and we'll set the system item as add. That will display as a plus sign, and that's basically what we'll want. So we're just setting up the table view to have a plus sign, and if we tap that plus sign, it will take us to a member view, and it knows that we're adding a new member. Okay, so that's that navigation. So that's the way it would look, and we would see it that way. I think we already saw that. So if you tap the plus sign during this display, you'll want to go to the member view with the default values. And if you want to edit an existing member, you want to essentially tap a member, and that should take you to the member view showing you the contents of that selected cell. Okay? So what do we have to do to add a new member? Okay, let's take a closer look at that. So on the member side, we want to embed the screen in the navigation controller, okay? Because from the member side, we'll need to go back to the table view, right? And there are two ways we'll go back. We'll either start making changes and we'll say cancel, which means forget about it, or we'll say save, which means either update the existing member or add the member. So this is fairly complex. And notice that the save button is disabled. And the reason it is the status of the save button, whether it's available or not, is a critical element in the design because it gives you control over whether or not the user puts in garbage or not. For example, you don't want, if they're creating a new member and they don't put a name in, you might want to have a business rule that says you must have a name. Otherwise, you can't add them to our database. We don't know who it is. Or you might have a business rule that says you must have an email, and the email must be valid email. So you can check to see if it's a valid email. And unless it's valid, save doesn't get enabled. You can't save it unless it's valid, and so on. So we need to embed the member view in a navigation controller, because that will essentially allow us to navigate back to the table view, and that's going to create an interesting problem for us, which we will then solve. And in solving it, we'll learn a whole other important thing. Okay, so as you can see, we're kind of walking down the path that I walked as I try to build this thing. In other words, you go over here and now you realize, watch what happens when you have a, okay, so this is all the stuff I just said. Now notice this. There's a problem. The problem is that the navigation thing is chopping off a part of the image. And you might not think that's too important, but it doesn't look good, right? I mean, you don't want a navigation control chopping an image. So what do we do then? What do we do? Well, there's a simple solution, and one thing, and just to give you a little background, because most of you weren't in Bob 1. In Bob 1, the way you notice that when we start editing, the thing scrolls up to make room for the keyboard, and then the image fades, right? And the way we did that is we detected when the keyboard comes into the screen, and then see that little arrow down at the bottom? That's a constraint on the stack view that contains these 5 text fields, and we just changed that constraint. We made it larger, and if we make it larger, it pushed everything up. And at the same time, we also faded the image. So we get a very nice, that Warren liked.
Beautiful.
So it's faded and slid up, and it's very cool. So here's a possible solution. Solution is, hey, let's just make that initial constraint smaller, and then it will not be bumping up. Turns out that's the wrong solution, but let's see why. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we simply go into the we move everything down. So we do that by changing the constant text stack bottom. That's a constraint. Many of you may not realize that constraints, which control how things are laid out in a view, can be, you can get an outlet to a constraint, and then you can control it programmatically. So you have a lot of controls over a lot of things. So we can change that constraint from 80, which is what it was in the beginning, to 40, and that fixes problem number 1, but it creates another problem. And so let me first do it, and then I'll show you the other problem it creates. I'm going to move this guy up a little. I'm going to take the starting arrow, put him back in here. So this is the controller for this. Okay, so these are the constraints, and if I go to the size classes, notice that it's 80, and that constraint is this particular thing, this number. Okay, so if I change that to 40, you might think, hey, we're home free, right? I wanted to have the navigation bar in there. Okay, and now if I run this, okay. And as you can see, I already put in the cancel and the save buttons. This is just a drag and drop of navigation bar items that you drop up there, and you give them the names. And so that seems to have solved the problem of the cutting off. But watch what happens now. If I go in and make an edit here, I've got part of my, I don't have the date join displayed, right? It's down here. You can see it this way, but if you go to change something else, it's covered up. So here's the problem. We have a picker and a keyboard, and certainly on different size formats, the keyboard could be different sizes. And we're hard coding the movement. And that's just a terrible practice. So what we want to do is we want to find out what the keyboard size is, how high it is, and then respond to that. So we just move it out of the way depending on how big it is. Okay? So I'm going to take I'm going to try and go through this fairly quickly to show you how that's done. And so, yeah, that's what I was showing here. So it's a hardwired move of 180, and I'll show you where that 180 move takes place. So, so we want to have the height of the keyboard. And the way we can get the height of the keyboard is by, first of all, subscribing to a notification that tells us when the keyboard is showing up. So when the keyboard shows up, we want to say, okay, what's the height of the keyboard? And then we'll move that amount out of the way. So we're going to add an observer that's going to tell us what we're listening for is the keyboard will show. And when it does, we're going to execute a function called keyboard will show that we will write. Okay? And then the keyboard will show will then call the keyboard move function that we already built. But we will modify it in two ways. One is the keyboard function that we have before just needed to know if it's going up or down. Now we need to get the notification, because the notification will tell us the height of the keyboard. So it gets a little hairy here. What we want to do now is basically edit the member view controller, taking into account the dynamic response to the keyboard. And we do that. Where's the TableView controller? We already had an observer for keyboard will hide because we used that in Bob 1 to respond to when the keyboard goes away. But we're now also enabling the keyboard will show a notification. Okay, now this was something we used before. We're just going to disable it. And the reason we're disabling it is before text did begin editing, we used that to essentially trigger the moving of the keyboard up. So when the text field did begin editing, we move the keyboard up. And we're not going to use that anymore because we're going to use keyboard did show. So we want to get that out of here. And we get that out of here by doing the reverse of what we've been doing all along here. Okay, so now this is no longer here. And over here, so here is the keyboard function keyboard will show. And so we enable this, but there's a problem here which will become very apparent in slide 24, because we now need to have a notification in here. But let's just leave that for a minute now. And let's go through the rest of the 23 slides. Okay, so that's it for 23. For the keyboard to respond on the basis of height, we're going to be adding this keyboard move function, and we're going to be disabling the current keyboard move function. They're very similar, except in one way. This keyboard function adds a notification as a parameter in the function, and it takes the notification and it takes the user info property of the notification. The user info property is actually an array, and it contains a variety of pieces of information. And the key, it's a dictionary. It's a dictionary, I think. So UI keyboard frame begin user info key. That key will essentially give you the keyboard frame. So we create a property, keyboard frame, which we get from the notifications user info property. I think this sounds very, convoluted, but this is where the information is. And this is how you get it. And this is the information you need to accomplish this. And this spells it out for you in very precise detail. And then you take the height property of the keyboard frame, and that tells you the vertical height of the keyboard that just appeared. Regardless of what phone you're on or what angle, it just gives you that height. So you're no longer concerned about where you started from or any of that. And then you take that and you call it a stack move. That's actually a bad choice of, it should be a stack height, but in any case, you just say if the move is up, the alpha, which is the transparency of the image, goes to 10%, which is why the image fades, and the constraint, the thing that constrains it to the bottom, is increased by the height of the keyboard plus 10. And if it's not going up, in other words, it's going down, the alpha becomes 1, which is 100%, and the constraint goes back to the original. So this is where the thing is going up and down, and this is where you've tied it to the height of the keyboard. Okay? So now we're looking for slide 24. And slide 24 now, we can't use that keyboard move because it's no longer valid. Let's just go right, and we can't use that over here either. But what I want to show you is, here is the way, this is the way it is originally. See what it is? It just adds 180 points. When we first did this, people said, where'd you get 180? I said, I tried different numbers. I'm sorry, I'm pointing to this one. Okay. This is where we'll move the keyboard up. So we just move it 180. Now we're moving at the keyboard height plus 10. So now we're very precise. Here, we made a guess. It looked okay, but obviously as soon as we put in the navigation bar, it screwed things up. So we want to get rid of this guy. So to get rid of this, we say, okay, that's no good. And we go over here and we get rid of these two. And now that's out. And in its place, we put in this one. Very easy to write a lot of code with a couple of lines this way. Anyway, so you can see here it is, stack move plus 10, and over here it's, constraint plus 180. Okay, so we changed that, and we also need to change And because we've changed that, now we can't use this keyboard command because it doesn't exist anymore. So we'll use this one, and that should make it healthy. And we can't use this one, and we'll use this one in its place. And let me make sure I got all the 24s. I think I got them all. Okay. So let's go take a look at that. Okay, so here's Einstein, and here's what you'll notice. When we go to member, it goes like that, and it's exactly 10 points above. And if we go to change the name, it adjusts again, so it's always clear. Doesn't matter where we go. Okay, so now we've learned how to do that. That's an important function that you need. If you work with the keyboard, you need to handle it some way. Okay. All right, so now we're getting more to the table stuff. We're going to start connecting it all up. So to connect the table view to the member view, you need to add a new member. You control drag from the plus to the navigation controller. And then you select present modally option for the type of segue. And then you specify the storyboard segue identifier as add member. A segue is a class. For example, we'll have two segues from that table view, one from the plus and one from the cell. So you need to know which one, where you're segueing from, because you're going to land on the member view. So this is the way you create the segue from the plus, and basically it's a control drag, present modally, and add member view, and you put the identifier right in there. What actually happens when you segue to another UI view? Well, basically, it's where you get a chance to prepare either information you want to send over there, or you want to take control of the view you're going to and do some setups over there. But in any case, you need to know the name of the view you're going to, and that's usually thought of as the target view. If you're doing a segue to a navigation controller, then you're actually the UI navigation controller is that what's called a destination, and the view itself, which is inside of the navigation controller, and the navigation controller is a container for the view, is a property of the navigation controller called top view controller. So in that case, you have to say that the destination is the navigation controller, and then the target itself is the property of the navigation controller. And you have to downcast it as the specific controller of the view that you're using. In our case, it's the member view controller. Finally, you're going to use the prepare for segue as the place where you set things up in the target view controller. So one of the things you want to set up is you want to tell that controller that this, in fact, is a new member if you're segueing from the plus key. And you want to set the title as add member. So these are the two things you would do if you're segueing, doing a segue to that. If, however, the segue is from a cell, okay, then in that case, you would do your segue directly to the UI view. And this would be a type show, which means you're passing information to it, and you're basically putting the view into the stack, and then when you're done with it, you'll pop it off the stack and send the information back to the view that originated the send. And here it's somewhat similar. The target destination for you now is the actual view, and new member property of the member view is set to false, and the name of the title is now edit member. And there's one more thing that you need to do here is you select the data from the correct row, and you populate it into a instance of a member. We'll call it selected member, and then we'll make in the target view the property this member equal to that selected member. That's basically how you're passing the data of the cell you've tapped to the target, which is the member table view cell. And we already saw that when you're displaying an existing member, that the system just takes whatever is in the this member property and populates the view with it. So let's actually go ahead and do this. We've loaded up the member table view controller, and we search for slide number 27. And this is disabled right now, so we need to enable it. So in the usual way, we just add a line here. Go to the last one here, and while we're at it, let's also enable 28. So now we've got 28 enabled, and I think that's all we have in the way of slides for 27, and also for 28. And that should be good. So let's see how that looks. And see how it plays out. So the first thing we need to do is create the segues here. So we're going to, and notice, by the way, I already moved the starting position to the navigation controller for the table view. It was over here before. And if I select this and do a control drag right to here, I'll get the options, and I'll be selecting present modally. And then if I select this, I can go in and put in the identifier add member. And that's it. We just made a segue from the table view right into the member view. And now we also want to do a selection from the cell. In this case, we want to be a little more careful because there are stack views and all kinds of other things going on here. So we want to select the member view, and we want to go from here, table view cell, drag it to that and make that a show segue. And now we also need to give this an identifier and just make sure that this is a show, it's a segue, and the identifier here, we'll call it edit member. Okay, and so, and we can, so each of these segues, this is a present modally, it's called add member. This one is a show, and it's called edit member. And this is basically how we go from this view to this view, and how we move, how we tell this view that in the case of this segue, that this is a new member, and in the case of this segue, that this is a current member, and here's the data from the cell. Okay, so let's actually take a look at and see how that works. So we'll start that up. So if we want to first test a new member, we click on here, and voila, we get our new member. Now, we haven't done anything with cancel or save, so they will not work right now. So we're just going to stop this and run it again. And this time, we will go from a cell. So we can go from, let's go from this guy right here, and we indeed get Fred Zapata coming up. So we have our segues working correctly, or as we expect. And just to summarize what we just did, we did a segue from the plus sign, and that created a modal segue right here, right directly to the navigation controller. We also did a segue from the cell, and that created a show segue that basically gives us, that kind of a thing. So in Bob 2, we implemented table view and designed a custom cell for our member data. From the table view, we can either add or edit members. And as we saw, selecting the plus in the table view will display an empty member. And we can then fill the missing information. Tapping any of the cells will display the member we tapped with the data for that member. And then we can go ahead and edit that. If we press the plus, we get this. If we press Lucy, we get that. Okay, how do we get back to the member list without changes? For that, we'll want to have a cancel button. And to put a cancel button, we'll need to create an IB action function, and we'll call it cancel bar button. The function handles the cancel for new members, which is a modal request with a dismiss, but it handles, and you can see it right here. So if it's a new member, then we know that it's a modal, and we're going to dismiss it. And if it's and it's just simply the dismiss command, animated true, completion nil. And if it's not a new member, then we're just using the property of member to determine whether or not it's a new member or not. If it's not a new member, we're going to, since it's a show, since that view got there as a show, we're going to pop it off the stack. Next thing, we want to be able to also make saves. So if we've made changes, to the view, we'll want to go in there and capture those changes and then send them back. So before we get into the save button, let's implement the cancel and see how that works. So for that, we'll go back to the member view. And I believe we want slide 31. And there's the cancel button code. And let's enable that. And once we've enabled that, we now should have a working cancel button. So let's try that. And if we go here, it's new. If we go cancel, we go back here, we go here, we get this guy, and we cancel, and we're over here. So that seems to work fine. So really the only thing we need to do now is we might want to add a save button, and right now the save button won't do anything because we haven't really coded for it. So let's go back to our slide deck. And let's talk about the save button. So the save button is different than the cancel button because this cancel button is always available. No matter what you did, you made some edits, you made a mistake, you just want to hit cancel, you bail out of there. Save button, if you make mistakes and you don't notice them, it's not a good idea to save them. So you want to use the program to prevent you from saving bad data. So what we want to do is we want to have certain conditions met before we allow you to save the button. So one of them is that the member name is there. If there is no member name there, we don't want you to save. You can't save it without a name. Similarly, you can't save it without an email. Not only that, but we're also going to insist that the email is in a valid form, which means it's got at least 3 characters, an ampersand, at least 2 characters, a period, and at least 2 characters. If it satisfies that requirement, it's okay. If it doesn't, we won't make the member email Boolean positive, and then the save button will not be enabled. And finally, there are circumstances where you have a valid name and a valid email, but you've just made a change to the photograph. In that case, or a change to the city. The guy has moved. In that case, any change you make, there has to be some change that has to have been made before the save button is enabled. Okay? So we have to have at least one change. And finally, just take a note of the fact that when you have new members, all of these variables are set to invalid. In other words, a new member doesn't have a name, a city, or an email by default. Therefore, new member Boolean is false, member email Boolean is false. And existing members are always set to valid, because if it's an existing member, you're pulling the data from your storage, from the table view, and that data only could get there if it came in through here. Therefore, it was validated before. Therefore, it's valid now. Okay, so that's how we do that. So let's go back to the code now and see all the things we have to do in order to enable the save button. Okay, it actually turns out to be one of the more complicated things here. We're going to do a search for changes to slide 32. And the first one we find is if it's a new member, we want to set both of these things, member name and member email, to false. Okay. Next, if it's an existing member, we want to set them both to true. Okay. Now, if we're adding a photo, then the save button just needs to check to see if the member name and member bool are true. Because if they are, then we can set to save. Now I'm getting this red button here, and I don't know why. And then we also want to, in the text field, anytime we make any change, we want to set that to true. And if we have member name Boolean, now here's where we're testing the validity of names. And if it's valid, we want to set it to true. And if it's not valid, we want to set it to false. And same thing over here. And over here. And finally, the save button is enabled at the end of the editing if in fact all three are true. Well, we got a lot of errors here. We'll figure this out in a minute. Oh, I see what the errors are. We should have done this one first. So if we enable this and enable this one, this is where we define the initial values for these three. So we should now have no errors in place. Yeah, they're all gone. Yeah, so we just did them in the wrong order. It's always a good thing to learn. We have this unique system here of writing the code. We just enable code that I've pre-written. But basically, at this point, the save button should be enabled correctly. And before we actually go in and test it, let's actually go back to the slide deck and take a look at what else needs to happen here. The way we leave the screen from the view where we want to save is we do what's called an unwind segue. So it's a special kind of segue. So when we press the bar button, basically what we want to do is we want to save the changes for the member on display and return to the table view, which now will either update the current member, the one that got us here, or we'll add a new member. So in other words, the way we respond in the table view to a save is different. So the unwind, this is where, so again, we will need a prepare for segue in this view to assemble the data to send it back to the table view, okay? Just like you did a prepare for segue when you went over to this, when you go from the save back, you're not just dismissing a view, you actually need to send information back there, and we do that through something called the unwind segue. It's a special kind of segue. And that segue is created by first creating a place for it to go. So we actually go in and manually create a function, but it's got to be preceded with an ampersand IB action. Because if it's a new member, we want to add the information, and if it's edited member, we want to update them. So we're going to create a segue by doing a control drag from the save button to the exit, and then to the unwind segue member. Let's just take a quick look at the prepare for segue. And that's going to be right here. It will show when you press the save button, it will, because the segue is connected to the exit button, it knows you're leaving this view. So it goes to a prepare for segue. And in this segue, you basically will assemble information. And what you're actually doing here is you're taking the data from the various things that are on display, and you're stuffing them into the instance of a member that you're keeping as a property in this UI view. Namely, the image is just this member.image. The member name is this member.name, and so on. The date joint is in the date field, and it's just the text. The actual information for member level and member status, we've already stored when we set it. So we already stored it in this member. We can take a look at that if you want. But basically, we've already done that. So the preparation here is taking the information that's on display. Some of it was typed in, some of it was selected from a picker, some of it from a date picker, and we're now stuffing it into an instance of a member, and now we're going to send that back, okay? So this is slide 34. Let's go ahead and take care of that. And there is the prepare for segue, and that's very straightforward. We just disable this, and this, oops, and disable that. And now this now is a fully functioning prepare for segue. Now this tells it, pack up the member and get ready to send it back. And now let's go back to our, and this is where we want to, like prepare for segue is the pitch. This is the catcher. So we're going to catch the unwind here. And what are we going to do here? If the sender, the source of the send, first we confirm that the source is the member view controller for the segue. And then if that's the case, right, that's the source controller, we set that equal to an instance of the member view controller. So now in the table view, we've passed the member view controller, and so now we can get our hands on the property called this member, and we just copy it into a local property called member, which is just a member. Now, what are we going to do with that member? That's just an instance of the class member. We then, if the selected index path is the same one that's in the selected row in our table view, then we know that it's an update, and we simply set the value. We then essentially update the value in our array for a particular member. In other words, we set that row, we set that index for that array equal to the member. And then we update the table views. In other words, we're doing two things here. We're updating the array, and then we're reloading the rows at that selected path. So now reload basically means go back to the sample members and update the information that's now in the sample member for that particular array and that particular member of the array. Now, if it's not that means we're adding something, and in that case, we simply say there's a new index path, which is, and our table only has one section, so we hard code section 0. And the row number, remember the count is the number of elements in the array. So, and the index numbers start at 0. So the count would be the next available array number. So we just simply say add member to sample members at that index path. Okay, and then so first we append a member to the array of members, and then we insert into our table view at a specific index path that particular member that we just appended. Okay, so that's number 35. Let's go and do that. And that, of course, happens in the table view controller. So let's go here and search for 35. And there's a lot of, let's enable it and then we'll see what's going on here. So as you can see, I've added some print buttons This just helps me during debugging. It'll also help you to see exactly where you are if you're playing with this code. But basically, this is the same code that I just discussed, and with some other print statements in here that are just there as a convenience for you and when you're looking at it. But here's what it does when it's essentially updating, and here's what it does when it's adding a new member. Now, we need to physically create the save. So we're going to essentially control drag the save to the exit button, which is this one right here. And we will, because we already created that unwind in the table view, our action Segue will find it and display it. So this way you can see that an unwind to exit can take you anywhere you want, because basically no matter where in your project you have the glove waiting to catch the unwind, it will go there. Notice that this is right here is the exit button for this UI view. So we hold the control key, drag and drop this to the exit button. When we do that and let go, the unwind save member with sender IB action that we created pops up. We select that, and now we've got it all wired up. So let's now go ahead and run this and see how a save works for both a new member and a current and an update. So let's go and update Einstein. So if we click on Einstein, and we want to move him from New Jersey, select all, and we'll put him into Santa Monica. And we'll say we're done. And as you can see, save got enabled. And you can play around with, if you want to explore how the save works with various things. And now we'll say we want to save that. Yeah, he's in Santa Monica now. So he's no longer in Princeton. So that seems to work fine. Let's add a new member. And we'll call this new member Bob. And he lives in New York City. And his email is bob@bb. Let's say if we try to do that and say done, then you'll see the save is not enabled and BB still is not good. So we want to go and change that to a valid @nn. And let's say Bob is a member now, but he's a novice. And today's July 10th. So now we're done with this. Oh, we forgot to add an image. And this just takes us to our camera roll. So we'll put an image of this thing and we'll save it. And there he is, Bob, New York City member and novice. So we've got that working. And so we're moving along. Okay, so next is final touches. We want to implement a delete. So the question is, how do we do that? Well, first thing what we need to do is we need to add an edit button. And we can do this with a drag and drop, with code. If you do it with code, it will not display on the main storyboard. And the code will look something like this. You're just basically adding a left bar button. It's edit button item, and so we'll show the word edit. There are two table views that we need to also enable. One is called can edit row at and editing style in member table view. And if we enable those, we will basically have a working edit button. So let's go and do that. So here is override table view, can edit row at. This simply is a function that enables editing functions in your table view. It's all part of your table view class. So without getting into the details of it, I'm just going to say that if you enable this kind of a function, you'll have the ability to suppress or not suppress specific index paths for editing, so you can block editing in certain cells. And what this does is it's an override to support editing, and the only editing we're supporting, as you can see, is the delete. So we've done these two things, and we also want to make sure that we have enabled the navigation item here. So now, if we run this, so now if we want to edit this list, we want to, let's say, we've got Einstein, and let's say we want to delete Einstein, or delete anybody, we can click done, and if we press here, get a delete button, and we can delete them. If you press, and so you're done, you can do this. It also supports a swipe, so if you want to delete Zapata, you want to delete Lucy, you can just press this, and now they're gone. So now there is a bug here which I'm going to show you, and then I'm going to tell you how to find it. And it's an interesting bug. Okay, so let's say we go in and start this, and we say we add an image, we put this in, and we add a name, and it's just SS, we add a city, we add an email, as long as we have the basic criteria for an email, which is, as you can see, and I'll just make this a presenter experienced, and I'll change this to 2018, and there it is, and then we'll save it. Now, if we go to Einstein, what? We got the guy we just added. Wait a minute. If we go to Lucy, she's okay. We go to Einstein, oops, what's going on? Okay, so what's going on is that we left some, it's like the surgeon who leaves the scalpel inside the stomach. We left something inside. So for those of you who have been following this in your own copy of the code, you can try and figure this out on your own. If you really get stuck, just do a search for slide 39, and that'll take you to the area where it's a problem. This talk was presented on July 5 at a Learn Swift LA meetup at Event Farm. I want to thank Stephen Berard for being such a gracious host.